The night was supposed to be a celebration. Amina, a young bride, walked into her in-laws' mansion in Kumasi, where chandeliers sparkled above her and golden plates decorated the long table. Everything looked perfect, but as the laughter and music faded, the mood shifted. Her mother-in-law, with eyes cold and piercing, leaned forward and demanded that Amina remove her bridal jewelry. These were not just ornaments, they were heirlooms from her late grandmother, priceless treasures filled with memory and love. The demand shocked everyone. Forks clinked on plates, whispers filled the hall, and Amina felt her chest tighten. This was no family dinner. It was a trap. Instead of breaking down, Amina sat still, a small smile forming on her lips. Her calmness unsettled the very people who wanted to see her cry. Under the table, her fingers brushed against a hidden bracelet, and with one quiet press, she set her plan in motion. Within minutes, heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The grand doors burst open, and in came her private security team, dressed in black, their eyes scanning the room. Gasps filled the air. The mother-in-law's face drained of color as Amina leaned back, her jewelry still shining. "You wanted what's mine," she said softly, "but maybe it's time everyone sees what you've been hiding." Documents slammed onto the table, exposing secret debts and betrayal. The proud family crumbled in front of their guests, and Amina stood tall, no longer a timid bride but the woman who ended their empire with just one smile and one button. Amina sat at the long shining table, her fingers resting on the edge of her plate, trying to keep her hands from trembling. She had thought this dinner was to welcome her into the family, but the truth was now in front of her. Her mother-in-law's words cut through the air like knives. With a voice loud enough for every guest to hear, she declared that the jewelry Amina wore was not hers to keep. She said the gold, the diamonds, the heirlooms from Amina's late grandmother, belonged to the family legacy and must be returned. The words were not just a demand. They were an accusation, a statement that Amina was not worthy to sit at their table, not worthy to carry anything so precious. The sparkle of the jewels under the chandelier seemed to mock her, because instead of pride, they now brought her humiliation. All around the table, guests leaned toward each other, whispering behind their hands. Some gasped, others smirked, enjoying the spectacle. It was clear this was no sudden outburst. The mother-in-law had planned this moment carefully. She wanted to embarrass Amina, to crush her spirit in front of the very people who should have been celebrating her. What hurt even more was the silence of her husband. He kept his eyes down, his lips pressed together, too afraid to challenge his mother. That silence was louder than any insult. Amina realized she was alone in this battle, surrounded by people who wanted to see her stripped of dignity. The mother-in-law leaned closer, her eyes burning with greed. She repeated her claim, saying the jewels belonged to the family, that Amina was nothing more than an outsider wearing treasures she did not deserve. Every word dripped with contempt. Amina could feel the weight of every stare in the room, people waiting for her to break down, to cry, or to give in. The humiliation was deliberate. This was not about jewelry. This was about power, control, and a cruel attempt to put her in her place. But Amina did not move. She sat tall, her back straight, her face calm even as her heart pounded in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, the woman who had given her those heirlooms with love, not with conditions. Those jewels carried memories of family, of strength, of blessings passed down through generations. They were never meant to be stolen under the disguise of tradition or greed. In that moment, Amina made a choice. She would not let them see her pain. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not surrender to their cruelty. Her mother-in-law's voice grew sharper, trying to provoke her, but Amina only smiled faintly, a smile that unsettled the entire table. People expected her to crumble, yet she remained still, her silence stronger than any argument. And though she had not yet revealed her plan, her calmness was already her first act of defiance. It was the beginning of a storm no one in that room saw coming. All eyes were on Amina, waiting for her to collapse under the weight of the humiliation. The guests leaned forward, hungry for drama, ready to see her cry or plead for mercy. They wanted a scene. They wanted to watch her hand over the precious jewels, broken and defeated. Her mother-in-law's sharp gaze pierced through the air, expecting instant obedience. But Amina did the one thing no one saw coming, she smiled. It was not the smile of a woman who had surrendered. It was calm, steady, and almost unsettling, a smile that carried quiet strength. It spread slowly across her face, making the room shift uncomfortably. The mother-in-law's lips tightened. This was not the reaction she had prepared for. She wanted tears, not a smile. She wanted to see Amina's spirit crack like glass. But instead, Amina sat tall, her back straight, her eyes unshaken. That smile carried power, as though she knew something no one else at the table did. The silence that followed was deafening, louder than any shout, and the tension grew heavier with every passing second. The guests, who had been whispering with excitement, now whispered with unease. They sensed something they could not name, something bigger than the jewelry. Amina's hand gently brushed against her bracelet under the table. Hidden from sight, it felt like a secret only she knew. Her grandmother's jewels glittered proudly on her, but the true power rested in that tiny device on her wrist. She didn't press it yet, but just feeling it gave her strength. It reminded her she was not as helpless as they believed. Every insult, every stare, every cruel word bounced off her because deep down, she knew her moment was coming. Her husband glanced at her nervously, still refusing to speak. His silence was a betrayal, but Amina no longer looked at him for comfort. She did not need him. The guests waited for her to explode, to shout or fight back, but she gave them nothing. She only kept smiling, her silence louder than screams. That quiet defiance rattled the room more than any argument could. The mother-in-law shifted in her chair, suddenly restless, because the power she thought she had over Amina was slipping away. It was a battle without words, but Amina was winning. Her calmness was her shield, her smile her weapon. She understood something the rest did not: the strongest response to cruelty is not anger, but composure. By refusing to bend, she was already standing taller than everyone at that table. What they thought was weakness was in fact control, and what they thought was victory was only the beginning of their downfall. A storm was rising, silent for now, but it would soon shake the very walls of that mansion. And with one simple smile, Amina had already written the first line of their defeat. Amina's smile lingered, soft and calm, but under the table her fingers moved with purpose. She brushed against the bracelet on her wrist, the one her grandfather had given her before the wedding. To everyone else, it looked like a simple piece of jewelry, but hidden inside was a small panic button. Her grandfather, a man who had built his empire in security and protection, had insisted she wear it. "You never know when you'll need it," he had told her. Tonight, his wisdom felt like prophecy. With a quiet breath, Amina pressed the button. No one at the table noticed. To them, she was still just sitting there, smiling. Minutes passed, thick with tension. The whispers around the room grew restless, but Amina's calm face made them uneasy. Then, faint but steady, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, strong, and in rhythm, echoing across the marble halls of the mansion. At first, some guests thought it was servants, but the sound was too firm, too commanding. The mother-in-law frowned, confused, just as the giant double doors of the dining hall swung open with force. In came a team of private security men, tall, dressed in sharp black suits, their eyes sharp and focused. They moved like shadows, scanning every corner of the room, every face at the table. Their presence sucked the air out of the room. The smug smiles that had filled the faces of Amina's in-laws and their guests dissolved instantly into wide-eyed shock. No one had expected this. No one had even imagined that the young bride they thought was weak could summon power like this with the press of a button. The mother-in-law's fork slipped from her hand and clattered onto her golden plate. Gasps filled the room, some guests even reaching for their phones under the table, desperate to capture what was happening. The proud family who had always controlled every moment suddenly looked powerless, caught in the glow of the chandeliers with fear written across their faces. Amina did not rush to speak. She leaned back in her chair, calm and collected, as though everything unfolding was part of her plan. The leader of the security team walked straight to her, bowed slightly, and waited for her command. That single act was enough to change the atmosphere. Everyone in the room understood now that Amina was not just a bride in gold jewelry. She was the granddaughter of a man whose power reached far beyond wealth and titles. The mother-in-law's lips trembled, but no words came out. The silence of the guests was no longer filled with judgment, it was filled with fear and awe. Amina let the silence stretch, her smile never fading. With just one press of a hidden button, she had flipped the power in the room. The ambush had turned into her victory, and the hunters had suddenly become the prey. The room froze as the security team lined the walls, their presence heavy and unshakable. Amina leaned back in her chair, her calm smile never leaving her face. Her mother-in-law, who only moments ago sat tall and proud, now looked pale, her lips pressed together as if words had abandoned her. The silence was broken by Amina's soft but steady voice. "You wanted my jewelry," she said, her tone carrying through the hall. But I think it's time we talk about what you've been hiding. The words dropped like stones into water, sending ripples of shock across the table. Every guest's eyes shifted from Amina to the trembling woman at the head of the table. One of the security men stepped forward, carrying a black folder. He placed it firmly on the shining table, right in front of the mother-in-law. The sound echoed in the grand dining hall, and the mother-in-law flinched as though the folder itself carried fire. Amina gave a simple nod, and the man opened it, spreading papers across the gold-lined plates and crystal glasses. The guests leaned forward, gasping as they caught glimpses of the contents. These were not just papers. They were evidence. The documents revealed secret debts that the family had buried for years, massive loans hidden under false names, shady property transfers to offshore accounts, and records of land taken illegally. Every page screamed of greed and lies. Suddenly, it became clear why the mother-in-law wanted Amina's heirlooms. They weren't just beautiful, they were valuable enough to cover the cracks in her collapsing empire. The once proud woman shook her head, stammering, trying to deny what lay before her, but the evidence was undeniable. Guests exchanged looks, their whispers turning into gasps of disbelief. The perfect image of a powerful family was shattering right before their eyes. Phones slid out discreetly under the table, some recording, some snapping pictures. The scandal was no longer a secret. It was a story about to travel far beyond those walls. Amina sat silently, letting the weight of the truth do her work. She didn't need to raise her voice, because the papers spoke louder than any accusation. Her jewelry glittered under the chandelier, no longer a symbol of vulnerability but of victory. Every eye in the room was now on her, not as a bride to be mocked, but as a woman who had turned humiliation into power. The mother-in-law slumped in her chair, her face drained of color, her hands trembling above the papers. Her plan had flipped back on her in the cruelest way. She had set a trap for Amina, but she was the one exposed, stripped of pride and respect in front of her own guests. Amina remained poised, her calm smile sharper than any weapon. In one swift move, the hunter had become the hunted, and power had changed hands forever. The dining room felt like a stage, every guest sitting in silence as the truth unfolded piece by piece. The mother-in-law had already been exposed, her secret spread out across the golden table like poison. But the storm was not over. Amina stayed calm, her eyes steady, as another security man stepped forward carrying a second folder. He placed it in the center of the table, the sound sharp against the polished wood. The guests shifted uneasily, sensing that something even darker was about to be revealed. When the folder was opened, the papers inside made the room gasp. They showed signatures, contracts, and legal attempts to move properties and accounts under a single name. That name was not the mother-in-law's, it was Amina's husband. The man who had sat quietly through the chaos, pretending to be torn between loyalty and fear, was suddenly unmasked. He had signed off on documents that would have stripped Amina of her rights, cutting her out completely while securing the estate for himself. His silence had not been weakness. It had been guilt. The husband's face went pale, his lips twitching as he tried to form words. But the evidence spoke louder than anything he could say. Gasps turned into whispers, and the whispers grew into sharp stares. Friends of the family, business partners, and relatives all looked at him with disgust. The image of the devoted new husband crumbled in seconds. He had betrayed not only his wife but also the vows he had sworn so recently. Amina turned her head slowly toward him, her calmness more terrifying than anger. She didn't need to scream or accuse. The documents on the table had already judged him, and the room had become a courtroom where every guest was a witness. His betrayal was no longer a secret whispered in back rooms. It was on display for the entire world to see. The mother-in-law, already broken by her own exposure, looked at her son in shock, realizing the mess was deeper than she imagined. Her once perfect plan had now backfired so hard that even her own blood was caught in the flames. She reached for him, but he pulled his hand away, his shame too heavy. The silence around him was unbearable. Amina did not move closer. She sat tall, her jewels sparkling under the chandelier, her face calm but unreadable. She let him drown in the silence of the room, the silence of his own betrayal. Guests shook their heads, some whispering prayers, others pulling out their phones, already thinking of the headlines this scandal would create by morning. For once, the mighty family had no defense. Their pride, their power, their reputation, all shattered in one evening. The husband who should have stood by his wife was revealed as the sharpest knife in her back. And in that moment, everyone understood that Amina was no victim. She was the only one at that table still standing with dignity, while the rest crumbled under the weight of their own lies. The mansion that once held laughter and pride now sat in heavy silence. The chandeliers still glittered, but they no longer lit up a celebration. They lit up disgrace. The mother-in-law, who had once commanded the room with her sharp tongue and louder pride, now sat slumped in her chair, her face drained of every trace of confidence. When the head of security finally stepped forward and gestured for her to leave, she had no choice. Slowly, with her head bowed and her steps unsteady, she was escorted out of her own dining hall. The same hall where she had planned to humiliate Amina had become the place of her own downfall. Guests gasped, some covering their mouths in shock, others quickly lowering their eyes to avoid the shameful scene. But while some tried to look away, many could not resist capturing the moment. Phones slid out quietly under the golden table, cameras flashing discreetly as they recorded history being made. The once untouchable family, known in Accra and Kumasi's elite circles, was now being exposed in real time. The family that had always been admired for wealth and influence was reduced to whispers of corruption, betrayal, and greed. By the next morning, the story had already spread beyond the walls of the mansion. Social media buzzed with videos and photos. Headlines screamed across newspapers and online blogs: elite family scandal rocks Kumasi, greed exposed at lavish dinner, bride turns tables on in-laws. What was meant to be a night of shame for Amina turned into a story of quiet revenge that the whole country was talking about. Amina herself did not need to say much. Her silence at the dinner table, her calm smile, and her strength had already written her story. While her husband and mother-in-law were left drowning in disgrace, she walked out untouched, her dignity intact and her jewelry still glittering under the chandelier. She became the image people admired, the young bride who refused to bow to power and turned humiliation into victory. Guests who had once judged her now spoke of her strength with awe. Her name spread through circles where she had once been dismissed as unworthy. To many women, she became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that quiet strength can be louder than anger. To others, she was the woman who dared to stand against the most feared family and walked away victorious. In a single night, power shifted completely. The family's empire of respect was broken, not by violence, not by shouting, but by truth revealed under the glow of chandeliers. And at the heart of it all stood Amina, the bride they had mocked, now celebrated by strangers who saw her not as a victim, but as a woman who had brought an empire to its knees with nothing more than a smile and her unshakable composure. The dining hall was silent, broken only by the slow footsteps of security as they cleared the room. The proud family who once ruled with fear and arrogance now sat frozen, their eyes downcast, their whispers swallowed by shame. Amina rose gracefully from her chair, the jewels on her neck and wrists catching the chandelier's light, sparkling brighter than ever. Every eye followed her as she stood tall, no longer the quiet bride they had expected to humiliate but a woman in full command of the moment. She let her gaze travel across the table, over the stunned faces of relatives, business partners, and so-called friends who had all come to witness her downfall but instead witnessed a reckoning. Her voice was calm, but every word carried weight. A family built on greed, she said slowly, can never buy respect. Consider this dinner, your last supper with me. The words hit the room like thunder, leaving the guests breathless. No one dared to answer her. Even her husband, who had once promised to protect her, could not lift his eyes to meet hers. For a moment, the grand dining room seemed smaller, its golden plates and glittering chandeliers meaningless against the power of one woman's resolve. Amina turned without hesitation, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The doors opened for her, and she walked out, flanked by her security, her head high. She did not look back. That night, she left not as a humiliated bride but as the woman who had brought an empire to its knees, with nothing more than one smile, one button, and the courage to face them all.